members of your party have spoken at all. Do you see Republicans as ready to start a real conversation about climate change?
Yes, I do. And I think we should.
Why?
And I actually think.
What gives you that sense?
Well, it's becoming more urgent, more of a problem, and there's a better understanding of it. I actually think the Green New Deal is such a bizarre proposal and so far out that it gives us a chance to step up and say, this is a problem, but that's not the way to do it.
Well, just to jump in there, it is a resolution, right? It's not actually, it's a start of a conversation. It was a non-binding resolution. And some of the things you have in your plan, greener buildings, electric vehicles, are things that plan references. What makes that one bizarre and yours somehow more straight ahead?
Well, that one focuses on cows, combustion.
Cows are not mentioned in the resolution, Senator, in the one that was filed.
But the proposal was to deal with agriculture, and methane comes from cow burping.
So I'm looking at the
proposal,
and it says working collaboratively with farmers to eliminate pollution and greenhouse gas emissions, supporting family farming. It doesn't say anything about attacking cows.
They've cleaned it up a little bit, but
Okay.
they also talk about. Well, they talk about focusing on renewable energy, for example.
Right.
And right now, solar power has increased in our country, but it's only 2% of our electricity. Wind is only 9%. We can't run the country on solar power.
Be a smart grid? So could some of the other ideas in there be areas of compromise for you?
Oh, sure. The areas that I mentioned, I believe Democrats all could support. Advanced nuclear, natural gas, carbon capture, better batteries, greener buildings, electric vehicles, cheaper solar, even fusion, and even more money to do it.
It doesn't sound like you have that many areas of disagreement then. Why not consider the Green New Deal the start of a conversation, not the end of one?
It's the start of a conversation, but headed in the wrong direction, because what they usually mean when they have this kind of conversation is we're going to close the coal plants. That's not necessary. It really is a very radical proposal, and it provides a chance for Republicans like me or Democrats to take some of the things that we do agree with and focus on them. Let's get on with it. I'm chairman of the Energy Appropriations Subcommittee. Let's focus on these 10 grand challenges.
At this point, would you say that you feel like there has been a shift in the way people talk about this? And is that in part because of the Green New Deal proposal?
I would answer that yes. I think it's such a radical proposal and has attracted so much derision and caused so many Democrats political problems that it's caused Republicans to jump into the fray and say, okay, we've got a better idea. So I think it's good to have the debate, and I hope we keep having it over the next couple of years. And I think I'd like to see the new management be solidly bipartisan. But you usually start out in a political environment with partisan proposals. There's nothing wrong with that at all.
That's Senator Lamar Alexander, Republican of Tennessee. Thank you so much for speaking with us.
Thank you for your time.
What was billed as the first all-female spacewalk will not happen as planned on Friday. NASA says it doesn't have enough spacesuits in the right size ready for both women to maneuver safely and comfortably outside the International Space Station. NPR's Nell Greenfield-Boyce is here to explain how this highly anticipated walk could be foiled by a spacesuit. Welcome.
Hello.
All right, so I don't get this. NASA has been touting this historic all-spacewalk for a while now. How can it not have the right size suit?
So on Earth, astronaut Anne McClain trained in both a large and a medium hard torso spacesuit. But in space, she decided she liked medium best. That's what she wore for her first spacewalk last week. The trouble is her female colleague up there, Christina Cook, also wears a medium, and the station does not have two mediums that are ready to go. Only one of them has been prepped and maintained. And so NASA decided that a male colleague who can wear the large that's available will go spacewalking on Friday instead of McClain.
Why can't they just prep another medium-sized suit?
Well, the thing about spacesuits is the word suit makes you think that it's like clothing.
Like on a hanger. Grab that one out of the closet.
Exactly. It's not like that at all. It's like a human-shaped spaceship. And if you think about it that way, you can understand that there's all kinds of life support systems. I mean, this thing is all that stands between you and certain death in the vacuum of space.
You got to get it right.
And so it cannot be just sort of thrown on. It's got to be carefully prepared. And it's not going to happen for her before Friday, but she will get another chance in April, although that will not be an all-female spacewalk either.
I mean, this is really too bad because not that many women have gone spacewalking ever, right?
Yeah, so NASA said that last week when Anne McClain went, she was the 13th woman to go spacewalking, and that compares to like 200 men. And part of it is just because American women didn't fly in space until the early 1980s, but also, NASA's just had fewer women in the astronaut corps. Then again, the suits have been an issue.
What do you mean? How?
So the available sizes are medium, large, and extra large. And way back when, NASA was working on a small size. And eventually, they killed it for budgetary reasons. And this disproportionately affected women because women tended to be the ones on the smaller side. In fact, when NASA did an analysis of this in 2003, they found that none of the men were limited by spacesuits. A third of the women had no chance of ever spacewalking simply because they did not fit into a suit.
Wow.
And you can imagine that some women were kind of annoyed about this because spacewalking is one of the most prestigious things you can do as an astronaut. Now, I asked NASA about this today. I said, are there any astronauts that would be unable to spacewalk because they don't have a suit? And they said all of the active astronauts do fit into the existing sizes. That said, if they're not prepped and ready to go, they're not going to be able to spacewalk. So at least this astronaut will get another chance next month.
That's NPR's Nell Greenfield Voice. Thanks, Nell.
Thank you.
We're funded by you, our listeners, and by Arent Fox. Pasternak is now Arent Fox, providing legal counsel to companies throughout the world. More at arentfox.com. And Xfinity, offering Internet customers wireless service for the whole family with Xfinity Mobile. More at xfinity.com.
This is WBUR. Coming up on All Things Considered, state lawmakers consider banning child marriage in Massachusetts. In business news, the maker of OxyContin is settling a lawsuit from Oklahoma similar to the one filed by the Massachusetts Attorney General. Purdue Pharma will pay $270 million over its role in the national opioid crisis. Attorney General Maura Healey says their case will continue aggressively. The time is 6:18.
Support for WBUR's business report comes from Citizens Bank Wealth Management, which believes that the future you hope for is shaped by the advice you get and steps you take along the way. Whether you're trying to finance a business, save for upcoming tuitions, or contribute to an IRA, it's never too early or too late to get answers to your retirement questions. Learn more at citizensbank.com/retirement.
Remember, keep your energy up during WBUR's fundraising marathon on April 3rd with yoga and dancing at WBUR City Space beginning at 6 p.m. For more information and tickets, go to WBUR.org. Forecast says it'll be cold tonight but warmer later in the week. Here's WBUR meteorologist Dave Epstein.
Clear skies overnight tonight. Temperatures fall back to the upper teens in the very coldest spots. It'll be in the mid to upper 20s in Boston. On Wednesday, more sunshine, bright blue, temperatures in the mid 40s. For Thursday, again, it's sunny. Temperatures 50, winds are light. Friday will introduce a few clouds, but will also boost temperatures near 60. Saturday, more in the way of cloudiness, some sunshine. It's mild, temperatures in the 60s, perhaps near 70 in the Merrimack Valley. And Sunday, temperature around 60, little bit of shower activity.
Right now, 42 degrees in Boston. This is WBUR.
WBUR supporters include Beth Israel Lahey Health, 35,000 people, world-class doctors, nurses, psychologists, therapists, researchers, teachers, and more. Measuring success by the difference they can make in people's lives. Learn more at BILH.org. That's Beth Israel Lahey Health. And Applied Biomath, applying mechanistic mathematical modeling, simulation, and analysis to accelerate and de-risk drug R&D. More at appliedbiomath.com.
The pro-Israel lobbying group AIPAC is meeting in Washington this week. Both Democrats and Republicans are speaking at the conference, like they do every year. But Democrats are grappling with tensions within the party over how the U.S. should treat Israel. The party's presidential candidates skipped the conference, though other Democratic leaders went and addressed the controversy. NPR's Don Gagne reports.
When House Speaker Nancy Pelosi took the stage at AIPAC this morning, she unequivocally asserted her party's support for Israel and its security. And she stressed repeatedly that such support in Congress is bipartisan.
Israel and America are connected now and forever. We will never allow anyone to make Israel a web wedge issue.
That last part was clearly aimed at President Trump, who has labeled Democrats anti-Israel. And he's stepped up such attacks since comments last month by Democratic Congresswoman Ilhan Omar of Minnesota, who criticized those who support Israel as having an allegiance to a foreign country. Representative Omar later apologized, but the president isn't letting go. Take this as he talked to reporters Friday.
I don't know what's happened to them, but they are totally anti-Israel. Frankly, I think they're anti-Jewish.
Overwhelmingly, American Jewish voters think otherwise. A solid majority are Democrats. Exit polls show that 4 in 5 voted for a Democrat for Congress in 2018. In 2016, Hillary Clinton won the Jewish vote by nearly 3-1 over Trump. But at AIPAC this week, Vice President Mike Pence kept it coming.
It's astonishing to think that the party of Harry Truman, which did so much to help create the state of Israel, has been co-opted by people who promote rank anti-Semitic rhetoric.
Congresswoman Omar responded to the focus on her at AIPAC with a series of tweets, one of which said she has criticized AIPAC not because of its membership or the country it advocates for, but, quote, because it has repeatedly opposed efforts to guarantee peace and human rights in the region, end quote. AIPAC has long cited the bipartisan support it receives from elected officials. Democratic Majority Leader Steny Hoyer spoke and addressed the controversy ignited by Representative Omar without mentioning her by name.
When someone accuses American supporters of dual loyalty, I say, accuse me.
Political scientist Alan Abramowitz of Emory University says he doesn't see any of this having much impact on the Jewish vote, and he notes that Trump has his own problems with Jewish voters.
You know, his reluctance in criticizing white nationalists and white supremacists and even neo-Nazis is something that doesn't sit very well with Jewish voters.
Abramowitz says the president's rhetoric may be more about energizing his own base, especially white evangelical Christian voters. Democrat Andy Levin, like Representative Omar, is new to Congress this year. Levin, meanwhile, has this to say when I ask him about the divide among Democrats on Israel.
It's funny when you think about it, we have more unanimity on that issue than on many, many other issues.
Levin adds,
I sit on 2 committees with Ilhan Omar. I intend on building a strong relationship with her. We're learning a lot from each other.
The AIPAC conference wraps up today. The issue and the debate will remain. Don Gagne, NPR News, Washington.
Backers of an effort to ban marriage for all minors in Massachusetts compare such marriages to child abuse. As state lawmakers review the proposal to become the 3rd state to ban all child marriages, they now have some emotional testimony to consider. On reports.
Hearing room A2 fell quiet as Tammy Montero began to tell her story. Now 37, Montero described for legislators how as a teen in foster care, she became involved with a man 9 years older than her. She now describes him as part of a religious extremist group in Brockton.
I was still a virgin and my body was barely formed yet. A quiet teen, not much into boys. But this grown man now was showing an interest in me and teaching me what he knew from his Bible. He claimed I was chosen, part of God's chosen people.
Montero says it was easy for the man to get her parents' consent to marry her as a teenager, since her mother was unstable and her father in prison. With permission from her mother, he got the okay of a judge in New Bedford.
He was 25 and I was 16, and I had only known him for less than a year. And in one day, he walked out of the courthouse with complete custody of me and permission to make me his wife. I had absolutely no clue what marriage was about, what this contract was about, and what it was binding me to.
Montero was bound in a marriage that lasted 20 years. She says she spent the last 5 years trying to get out, finally breaking free with the help of a domestic violence women's center. The state's vital records show that 1,221 children, some as young as 14, were married in this state between 2000 and 2016. 83% of those children were girls. Newton State Representative Kay Kahn points out those married children do not have adult rights.
As a minor, you cannot file for divorce, an annulment, or an abuse prevention order, rent an apartment, open a checking account, and if married, seek services from the Department of Children and Families. A minor cannot purchase cigarettes, vote, or serve on a jury, yet they can marry.
The laws allowing children to get married with parental permission date back to a time when one of the few options for a pregnant teen was marriage. State child advocate Maria Mosaides endorses the bill and says times have changed.
Massachusetts birth certificates no longer, as they did many years ago, stamp illegitimate on the birth certificate of anyone who are the two parents or a single parent who's on a birth certificate that's not married. So there's no longer the stigma that was attached when this original bill was filed.
During her marriage, Tammy Montero gave birth to 8 children, the first when she was just 16. Since ending the marriage, she's moved out of...
Welcome to WBUR City Space at the Levine Broadcast Center. Please take your seats. The program is about to begin.
And save the lives of many young girls who are to come. I asked Massachusetts if they will put these laws in place to prevent anyone from going through the spiritual, emotional, financial abuse that I've gone through, and also the extreme heartache.
In other states reviewing teen marriage rules, there have been arguments that raising the age could violate religious freedom. There is no visible opposition here. Members of the Joint Committee on Children, Families, and Persons with Disabilities appear in favor of the bill, but it's unclear exactly when it will be taken up by the full legislature. For 90.9 WBUR, I'm Steve Brown at the State House.
This is 90.9 WBUR, online at WBUR.org. Coming up next at 6:30, it's Marketplace. Tonight, why McDonald's is in...
You pay attention with so much at stake.
Seas are rising and chronic flooding will be the new normal.
You navigate, you listen, you keep an ear out. You pay attention, and so do we. We tell the stories of our time every day.
In the 26th day of testimony and on the 139th witness, Shahar Tsarnaev wept.
We unearth what would otherwise stay hidden.
There's just a lot of hate in this world, and that day, for that hour, we were humans.
Across the street.
The Red Sox have won the World Series.
And around the globe.
It's here and now.
This is Modern Love.
This is WBUR's All Things Considered.
This is only a game.
This is On Point.
This is Radio Boston.
On air, online, on demand, and on stage in the heart of Boston.
I'm Jack Lepiars. Welcome to WBUR City Space.
Always looking forward, paying attention, and knowing that your story is one of our stories.
Good morning. I'm Bob Oates.
I'm Lisa Mullins.
I'm Meghna Chakrabarty.
I'm Jeremy Hobson.
This is 90.9 WBUR Boston.
Hi, my name is Amy Mcdonough. I'm the Director of Community Engagement at WBUR, which means I'm programming this space mostly, and it's killing me. How many people, is this your first time here? Okay, it's gorgeous, isn't it? There's nothing quite like this in Boston. I'd like to call it the 92nd Street Y of Boston. We're having conversations like this tonight, but we're also having hip-hop poetry, a dance performance of people who are physically handicapped. We've had a coffee house opera. We've had conversations with Boston chefs. We've had Moth Story Slam. We've had Chris Redd, the comedian. We've had live podcasts, and we haven't even been open a month yet. Carey Goldberg, our host of CommonHealth, is one of the most energetic, creative people at BUR. She so gets events. She understands that this is an opportunity to take her reporting to the next level and engage you and explain issues in a much deeper level. This is her idea. Her other idea is a 3-part series this spring, which we're calling Boston Brilliance. The first one will be on May 1st. with 2 millennials, and a Palestinian and an Israeli, who have their own CRISPR lab, which you describe as, you have a metaphor for that. It's like, to have your own lab is like
getting your PhD. They're in their mid-20s, they have their own lab. It's like getting your PhD when you're 14.
There you go. That's metaphors. That's our first one. So anyway, thank you for coming. Look at our website. See what else is coming up in the future. Okay, there we go.
Or no, I'm just mic'd.
Nope,
right?
you're mic'd.
Okay, great. You guys come on up. So thank you all for coming to a snappy evening on single payer, the pros, the cons, and what's possible. And I had this whole introduction written out, but then John Mcdonough said something so perfect right before we came in that I just want to use that, which is, this is a great big national conversation that we'll all be having over the next 19 months or so. And this is a small piece of that, and we should be having it. And it's, as Amy said, this is a space for civic conversation. And so I really hope that you'll look at this evening as your chance not just to listen to people who really know what they're talking about, but to ask questions and to challenge them and to use this time to wrap your head around this issue that's going to be very prominent in the coming campaign. And I should confess that my underlying concept for this evening was also that you can sense in all the coverage that the idea of Medicare for all or a single payer system is getting. You can sense that there's this sort of real tectonic shift happening in public sentiment around this idea. Like in 2009, it was not even on the radar screen, and now there was a recent Forbes headline that read, "Democratic 2020 hopefuls, all roads lead to single payer." So it's clearly going to be a looming issue. And my idea was that we can all sort of get a better sense of the new young idealism that's in play this campaign season, and also get a great big reality check from perhaps more seasoned idealists who have been mugged by reality in the past. And so they can help us set our expectations in terms of what can happen. And so we are very lucky to have this room full of expertise. I'll start at the end is Professor John Mcdonough from the Harvard School of Public Health. He's the director of its Center for Executive and Continuing Professional Education. But mostly I feel like he was in on the sausage making of Obamacare. And he knows things that he might wish he didn't know, but he can give us, no, or not, he can give us the view from inside that sausage factory. Then in the middle, Dr. Adam Gaffney, who's a pulmonary and critical care physician at Harvard Medical School and Cambridge Health Alliance, and he's the president, pretty new president, right, of Physicians for a National Health Program, which, as you probably know, is a nonprofit organization that advocates for single-payer healthcare reform. And then right next to me is Anya Rader-Wallach. She's Associate Director of the Center for Evidence Synthesis in Health and a professor of the practice in the Department of Health Services Policy and Practice in Brown University School of Public Health. And she's the one who saw the inside of Vermont. And it's very heroic effort to bring in single payer. And so the format I'm thinking will be each of our experts will speak for 3 or 4 minutes just to start us off. And then I'll have a couple of questions to get things going. But really, it's about you asking questions and making arguments. So, Anya.
Thank you. I'm sorry you had to give my title and workplace. That's a mouthful.
It was.
So first of all, I want to make clear to the audience that I am a supporter of single payer, and I'm excited by all that's going on in the atmosphere to sort of raise the profile of single payer and perhaps thereby make it more possible as the future of our healthcare system. But as Carey said, I worked in Vermont for 4 years. I worked for then Governor Peter Shumlin to get legislation passed and then pave the way for implementation of a single-payer healthcare system. And as John said when we were waiting to come up here, if there was any place where this would have been possible, it would be Vermont because of certain factors in terms of the politics in particular of the state and the nature of the healthcare market. But unfortunately, we failed, and I would point to a whole host of factors for why we did. Some of them are very specific to a state-level effort, so I won't focus as much on those because I don't think they're as relevant to the current scene. So I would focus on 5 major factors that I think contributed to our failure and are therefore impediments for any kind of effort in a state or at the national level, where I think it's probably more possible to pass a single-payer legislation and get a single-payer system implemented. Those are the politics, the taxes, the price tag, the cost trajectory, and the healthcare economy. And I'll just touch briefly on each of those. So the politics are what kind of, that's obvious. Some of the biggest interest groups in the country, most powerful interest groups, have a major influence on our legislatures, on our executive branches, and I think equally important on the perception of Americans about their healthcare system. And they oppose single payer. So that's something we just have to overcome if we're going to try to make progress on this front. The taxes are the thing that I was most cognizant of when I went into the Vermont experience. I said to the governor, this is the brick wall that we're going to hit eventually. And he said, no, we'll be okay, we'll be okay. But in the end, it was the straw that broke the camel's back there. And there are really 2 prongs to that. One is that I call them the big reveal and the big redistribution. So the big reveal is the fact that in moving to a tax-based system, you're having to reveal a whole lot of hidden tax that is embedded in employer-based health insurance, and people aren't aware of it. And when you make it explicit in a tax-based system, people suddenly become aware of the total cost in a new way, and that's difficult to swallow. The redistribution is related to the fact that a lot of people and employers and corporations pay for health insurance now, and a lot don't. And in trying to design a more equitable system, you have to redistribute that, and there are winners and losers, and that's also very difficult politically and practically. The price tag has to do with the fact that we talk about Medicare for all. That's kind of the catchphrase now in the presidential race, but I don't think that what most people are advocating for is Medicare for all, and certainly that was not the case in Vermont. Medicare is really not such great insurance, both in terms of the benefits, the breadth of the benefits, and in terms of the out-of-pocket exposure that people have. So what people really want, and particularly a lot of the most strongest advocates for single payer, is something that's much richer than that, which makes sense because you don't want to switch to taxes and have people still have to pay a whole lot out of their pocket. But it makes for a bigger price tag than people might be expecting. Also, the other component of price is provider payments. Medicare for all might be acceptable to some providers in this country, but probably not to a lot. They would want to see a much higher level of payment, so that jacks up your price tag as well. I won't focus on the healthcare economy. There was some writing in the New York Times this week about the sort of difficulty of switching from a system where there's 20% of your economy in healthcare to a different system, and others can address that more fully than I can. But the last thing I would hit on is cost growth, and this really was a killer for us in Vermont as well. You cannot find, so healthcare costs have grown for decades on end faster than our economy overall, and you cannot find a revenue source that you could tag to fund a single payer system that will keep up with growth in healthcare. So if you're trying to switch to a single payer, you are coming face to face with the necessity to somehow constrain the rate of growth in healthcare. And that's scary to healthcare providers, it's scary to healthcare consumers. And so ultimately, and it's elusive. Forget that it's scary, it's just really hard to do. So that's a lot of negativity, and I'm sorry to start your evening on that. I do have hope, and I think that there are ways that we can be pragmatic, that we can be better communicators around the trade-offs around single payer, but I think we have to be honest and go into this with eyes wide open, not with nothing but idealism.
Great. Adam, take the ball.
Great. So thank you for having me. So, I think the way I think about single payer is to think about what are the main core problems, dysfunctions, injustices, really, of the American healthcare system, and what fix would solve them. And I think when you view it that way, you realize that national health insurance, AKA single payer, AKA Medicare for all, is really the only solution to the grave injustices and dysfunctions of the American healthcare system. And so what are some of those? I think the first one is one that we're all pretty familiar with in terms of hearing about. It's the problem of the uninsured. Okay, 29 million people are uninsured in this country. As physicians, even though the Affordable Care Act certainly did a lot to bring that number down, that's still many people, and we see these patients, and they go without needed care. Studies have found that people are more likely to die if they don't have health coverage. It is an enormous problem, and it's really a moral stain on our country. So we have 29 million people uninsured. We need to bring that to zero. There's no other option. And so when you think of the ways of doing that, well, really the best way to cover everybody is with a plan that would cover everybody. It's how many other nations have achieved universal health care. Canada created a system in which everyone's covered. The United Kingdom as well. We can do the same now. We need to have a system that covers everyone to eliminate the problem of uninsurance. And few other plans would do so. But I think the second thing that is critical when thinking about single payer is not simply universal coverage, as it's called, but improving the coverage of people who already have insurance. So the most recent numbers show that almost half of people who are insured by their employer now have a high deductible health care plan. So what does that mean? Well, it's not just that you're having to pay more out of pocket when you see the doctor. It's that people are going without health care that they need. There was just a study this year in the journal Health Affairs that found that women with high deductible health care plans delay getting diagnosed and treated for their breast cancer. Other studies have showed that people with diabetes go without needed care because of their deductibles. I've certainly heard from many patients with chronic obstructive pulmonary disease say that they are not going to fill their prescription because the copay or the deductible is too high. Underinsurance is as much of a problem as uninsurance. Underinsurance, 44 million people underinsured in 2018. And so even though we've made progress about the uninsurance problem, we've actually maybe regressed when it comes to underinsurance. So if you want a solution, not merely to covering the uninsured, but improving the coverage for everybody else, including those who get covered through their employer, then you need a new plan that covers everyone, that covers everyone with superior insurance, that covers everyone with comprehensive insurance. The bills, in the Medicare for All bills in the House and the Senate, the House bill, lead sponsor was Pramila Jayapal, the Senate bill, Bernie Sanders. Both of them would provide what we call first dollar coverage, meaning essentially no copays or deductibles, which when you speak with an American audience, that sounds almost utopian, sort of, how's that possible? It's like you're saying, let's defy the law of gravity, but they managed to do it in Canada. You don't pay a copay or deductible if you get hospitalized in Canada, if you go to the doctor. And the UK, it's the same. It's doable. It's doable. Which brings me to the third reason why I think single payer is absolutely necessary, which is that how are we going to pay for it? And a single payer program has unique efficiencies that other sorts of financing mechanisms of healthcare do not have. And what do I mean by that? Well, in the United States, in a system in which there's a multi-payer, fragmented, privatized system in which doctors' offices are negotiating with multiple insurers. Insurers are coming up with different benefit packages. Hospitals are also dealing with multiple insurers. You have an enormous amount of waste on administration. The average one study found that the average U.S. physician practice spends 4 times as much money interacting with payers, with insurers, than Canadian doctor practices. The average American hospital spends 1/4 of its revenue on administration, half that in Canada. So we need to fix underinsurance. We need to fix underinsurance. We also need a way to generate the efficiencies to pay for that. And that's something that single payer is uniquely equipped to do. So it's really about what are the problems of the healthcare system today? How do we solve them? And I think when you use that framing, Medicare for All is the only real way to go.
Thank you. John.
Thanks.
Sorry.
Thanks, Carey, and thanks, Anya and Adam, for being here, and thank you all for coming. I just should let you know, in case you're wondering, Carey did not order us all to wear tweed. It just happened. No one knows why.
It's a tweedy evening.
And by the way, I just want to say, before I came, I saw a YouTube video with Adam on it on Fox News on March 1st. And by my count, it was 5 against 1, and you handled them with so much ease. It was brilliant.
Thank you. It was fun.
Really, really worth looking up. Really excellent. So if I ruled the United States, which you can be happy will never happen, the first thing I would probably do is single payer. But we don't live in a monarchy where these things happen. We live in a republic and a democracy where these things are a lot tougher. And my lens, as somebody who's been in politics, I was in the Massachusetts legislature for 13 years between 1985 and 1997, and I worked in the US Senate during the writing and passage of the ACA between 2008 and 10. And I have more of a political lens in terms of the challenges of actually making it happen. And I guess the way I'd like to start to frame the conversation is just a little bit of history. I'm going to do 70 years of health policy history in under 3 minutes.
I'm going to time you.
So we start in the 1940s. Harry Truman is president. Harry Truman decides, taking from FDR's legacy, that he wants to create a national health system modeled on what the British did, modeled on the British NHS. And so he makes this effort. He gives it a very hard push. And he has a catastrophic failure. Nothing happens. Nothing gets done. Doesn't even come up for a vote in the House or the Senate. Just pushed aside with scorn. And his advisors, reflecting on what happened, said, you know, it was probably too much to do. And we really needed probably to be a bit more realistic. We should have just started with the elderly and go from there. 15 years later, in 1965, LBJ signs Medicare into law. Now, a lot of people think that's the biggest, most gigantic health policy achievement in the history of the country, and you can make a good argument between 65 and 2010 with the ACA, but let's say we'll give that an edge. But compared to the ambitions of the late 1940s, what happened in 1965 was incremental and puny by comparison to the original ambition. Go forward about 27 years, early 1990s. Bill and Hillary Clinton come into the White House. They come into the White House, and number one priority is comprehensive U.S. health reform. They are going to redo, re-engineer the entire system upside down for everybody. And their plan was a little wonky and complicated, and it was a really solid, good plan. And they got nothing done. It was an utter failure, ended up losing both houses of Congress in the first midterm elections, next 6 years fighting Newt Gingrich and whoever else, and nothing got done at all. And one of the lessons that people who wanted it to happen learned is, maybe it was a mistake to say we're going to change health care for everybody when demonstrably many people liked what they had and didn't want to lose it. So 16 years later, Barack Obama signs the Affordable Care Act, deliberately engineered to avoid the mistake of 93-94. We are not changing the system for everybody. We are fixing the system for people for whom it is demonstrably not working. And in Barack Obama's infamous words, if you like what you have, you can keep it. Deliberately structured. So if you look at the history of the 4 major health policy episodes in the United States, I see a real pattern. So now, 9, 10, 11, 12 years after the passage of the ACA, we're looking again at health system reform, and really what this national conversation is about among people who care about our health system future, and I don't include in that the occupant of the White House who today filed petitions in the district court in Texas to overturn the entire ACA and repeal the whole thing. But for folks who do care about what's going on, it's really an important choice. It's a choice of, do we want to go and try to turn the whole system upside down, start all over, revolutionize the whole system, or do we want to fix the legitimate complaints problems, issues with the Affordable Care Act. And that is really what this conversation is about for the next 2 years. And then, if in 2021, Democrats control the House, the Senate, and the White House, then we can talk about something. If not, then a lot of this conversation will be very nice and stimulating, but it's not going to lead to a lot in the long run.
Yes. Thank you. So first, just to talk about questions, you're very welcome to, if you have your phone with you, go to slido.com and submit a question on Slido. Or there's a microphone right here, and anyone who wants to ask a question is very, very welcome to come there and ask it there. And please don't hesitate. Like, even if it's just something that you've been wondering about or that doesn't make sense to you, just come up and ask, because it's rare to have 3 such experts. I'll start you off with the first question, which was one that came in over Slido in advance, which was, if we do choose to move to Medicare for All or a single payer system, Adam, why don't you start? How would we get there from here?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I think the hardest part is the political part. It's overcoming the opposition. And I think in 2019, the greatest opposition is the corporate lobby for the pharmaceutical industry and for the health insurance industry. So there's no question that this is a major political fight. No one's making this, sound easy. But putting that aside, I think one of the questions is well, let's say we get that far and we actually pass a bill that creates a new system. How would we implement it? One thing to look at in terms of examples is simply to look at the implementation of Medicare in 1966, 1 year after it was signed into law by Johnson. There was many predictions at the time that the hospitals would be overflowing, that there would be all these dysfunctions. Didn't come to pass. It actually was implemented pretty quickly. They signed up essentially the entire, everybody over 65, and they got them into the program, and it worked out pretty well. So if they can do that in the 1960s without even these sort of aids of computer technology and things we have, there's no reason we can't sign everybody up for a new health insurance program today. And so, I'm not worried about the implementation. I think the much bigger hurdle is how we get there in terms of confronting the, incredibly wealthy corporate healthcare opposition.
Anya, would you care to challenge that, given that you ran into
Yeah, I mean, obviously I do worry about the implementation.
Adam, will your plan have a website?
Yeah.
Totally analog.
Yeah. I mean, forget about single payer in Vermont. I came back to Rhode Island, where I live, and was director of the Health Insurance Exchange, which was no easy feat. And we were one of the more successful states. So I do worry about implementation, and maybe I worry too much about it because I've worked in state governments implementing things for most of my career. I think there are huge issues in terms of the mechanics of whatever the program would look like, but also these kind of issues of disruption and transition. I'm not sure how we smooth those transitions, and I guess there's the rip the Band-Aid off kind of approach. In November, I was in Cuba on vacation and was intrigued by the fact that, here's a country where overnight the government took over all these private businesses and pulled it off, and you can say good things or bad things about it, but they were able to pull it off. So, you can fathom that this could happen, but I think there does need to be a plan for it, and we can't pretend that it's something that would just happen smoothly and efficiently because it makes sense.
And you're also talking about a $3.5 trillion industry, right? That would be, there was
20% of our economy. Yeah.
And what was the New York Times headline? It was like, this has never had, Medicare for All is proposing getting rid of private health insurance, which has no precedent in American history, right? Like, it would be.
Yeah, and I think some people have recognized that in their legislation, and the article makes reference to it, that there are plans for sort of job retraining and support to people who lose their employment. And I think that those elements would have to be included in a plan that would really be successful. And, like most things in our political system, you can throw a lot of money at it and it'll work. But if you're having to do it within constraints, which are realistic, then you have to be, I think, very planful about how you fund that transition and set it up.
And how would you fund a single-payer system? Yeah, Adam.
So, there's a couple of different ways to do it. There was a University of Amherst economic study that came out recently that proposed a number of taxes. So I think there's two ways to frame this, though. There's how much do we spend as a nation on healthcare, and is that money coming from people's bank accounts or is it coming through taxes, right? And those are two different questions. Really, nobody is talking about increasing the amount of money we spend on a nation as a result of single payer. Even the Mercatus Center, which did an economic analysis of Sanders' bill, and it's a libertarian think tank, even they estimated that the overall national health spending over a decade would actually fall by about $2 trillion as a result of single payer. But it is true that we're talking about funneling a lot more of those dollars through the government, or all of the dollars, basically. So, yes, I mean, in some ways, you could make the argument that it's not a big deal because we're actually spending we're already spending every dollar that we're talking about spending. We're not talking about taking a dollar that's currently being spent on, something else and putting it from education, putting it into healthcare. We're talking about dollars that are already being spent on healthcare. But it is true that you certainly need new taxes to replace existing private spending, premiums, copays, deductibles. So I think the economic analysis I mentioned uses a combination of a sales tax, of a capital gains tax, and an employer-side payroll tax. But really, that's not necessary. It doesn't have to be that exact mix. There's different ways to go about this. And yes, it is a political challenge. And I think that this is a complicated issue, so to get to where we want to be, we certainly need to do a lot more education, because I think for a lot of people it's confusing, and we have to kind of make clear that what we're talking about is existing money going into healthcare, going into the government, but the total amount of healthcare spending actually falling.
And John, having been in those back rooms, is there a way to do that? I mean, is there a way to both persuade the American public to accept shifting to taxes that they would pay, and also persuade the existing interests in this $3.5 trillion industry to accept this big a change?
No.
Yeah. I'm shocked.
I wish it were true, but I've been in these episodes, and there are patterns, and at the federal level. Also states, there are 3 states in the past 25 years that had binding single-payer initiatives put on a statewide ballot. And in each case, 1 per decade in the last 3 decades, in each case it started out roughly even, popular support, and then the interest money came in against it, outspent 4, 5, 10, 20, 100 to 1, and it went down pretty quickly because you lose control of the message. And just to repeat what they were, California, 1994, single-payer binding on the ballot right after the collapse of the Clinton plan, went down to defeat 73 to 27%. Oregon, 2002, during the whole backlash against managed care, so there's a lot of anger and upset around it, binding, single-payer, Oregon, 2002, went down to defeat 79 to 21%. And more recently, 2016, Colorado, again, after 5-6 years of civil war over Obamacare, binding single payer on the ballot, Colorado went down to defeat 79 to 21%.
They're all about the same.
And they're all about the same. And in each case, the proponents were way outspent. The opposition got to define the message, and they scared the heck out of people. And significantly, most of the healthcare industry came out against it. Not just the insurers, the hospitals, the nurses. In Oregon, it was the nurses came out against it as well. So it's really hard, and there are risks to it. There are risks because and I watched this from afar with the Clinton plan in '93, '94, and up close and personal with the Affordable Care Act in 8, 9, and 10. And when comprehensive health reform is on the table in Washington, D.C., what happens, it is so overwhelming. it is so controversial, even something incremental like the Affordable Care Act. It sucks up all the political oxygen in the room, so there's no room for anything else. And the tale I'll tell about it is, in 2008, Barack Obama promised people who wanted comprehensive immigration reform, I am going to deliver it to you in my first 2 years. So in January 2009, the immigration people came, said, hey, let's get going, we're ready. He says, well, no, we're doing health care first. We'll get to it, but we'll be done by Labor Day, and then we'll get right to you. And Labor Day turned into Halloween, turned into Thanksgiving, turned into Christmas, turned into Martin Luther King Day. Finally got done right after St. Patrick's Day in 2010. And at that point, the Tea Party had become such an enormous force that the Democrats were so frightened of doing anything, they were all hiding under their desk. And 8 years later, 9 years later, no immigration reform. And so there's an opportunity cost to going for this and losing. I mean, I assume everybody here wants something big to happen, whether it's single payer or something else, but you probably also care about climate change, you care about voting rights, you care about tax reform, education reform, ethics and government reform, on and on and on. But if you go into this, you might lose everything. And what we saw in '94, first 2 years of the Clinton administration, lost the House and the Senate. Nothing else was really much got done. The children's health insurance program was probably the high watermark. Yep. And then Barack Obama, he won, but in the fall of 2010, he lost the House. And he spent the next 6 years playing defense against Congress. And so I'm just saying there's costs and there's consequences. And I look for, when I listen passionately and closely to the single payer community, kind of recognizing some of these larger stakes. And I don't see it,
So I want to get to your question, but first, Adam, why don't you respond to that?
Look, nobody is claiming that this is going to be easy, and I appreciate your perspectives and historical perspectives. But the reality is that sweeping change does happen. There has been instances in American history of enormous changes that people never saw coming. I think you look at the civil rights movement as one example. Certainly in the 19th century, the end of slavery, even marriage equality. There are big changes that happen over time, and the best way to get to where you want to go is to hold out a very clear vision of what it is that we need to achieve as a nation, and not sort of offering something that is not as good with the hope that by compromising early, you're going to achieve it. I think that the way we get to where we want to go is by describing it lucidly, passionately, describing the ways in which it would fix the problems of the current healthcare ecosystem. And I don't know when it will be achieved, but I think we're not going to get there if we don't fight for it.
Thank you. Question.
I have so many questions.
Take as many as you want.
I'll try and condense them. My understanding, and please correct me if these numbers are wrong, is that about 7% of corporations' expenditures is on employee health care benefits. Is that a correct number? The bottom line at MGM or the bottom line at whatever, name any corporation, that the average is about 7% they spend on employee health care benefits?
I haven't seen that number. I'm not sure.
Does it sound right?
I think
It's
it
going
would
to
be
vary
higher.
a lot.
But
higher.
Yeah.
It could be higher.
Anyway.
I've been a nurse for 45 years. I came from a nonprofit, and I think the expenditures are almost 1/3 of the bottom line in the nonprofit for employee health care, because it's a good agency. But regardless, so the opposition money is pharmaceuticals, and the opposition money is the insurance industry. But these corporations are spending more than 7%, whatever that number is. It's huge. Why isn't big business for a single payer force? Take my employees' insurance off my hands. Yeah. If I pay 10% of my bottom line in employee benefits, then charge me 5% in taxes to support a nationwide system. I'd be spending half of what I spend. My employees would be covered, and I'm not in the insurance business. So I don't understand why big business, which is typically a Republican platform, wouldn't be for it. And I understand why the insurance big business isn't for it. But what about all the other big businesses? So that's one question.
Okay, so stop there. You can ask as many as you want.
I have to stop?
Yeah, just stop for the answer. And then you can do another one.
So,
okay.
actually been something that has befuddled me throughout my career. And it also gives me some hope, because I think there are two constituencies that I can imagine flipping in this scenario that are that have major influence. And one of them is business. The other is the physician community or healthcare providers more broadly. I think that it is plausible that either of those constituencies could get so fed up with the current system that they would say there must be a better way, en masse. And in the case of the business community, it's like there's this illusion of control, and they don't really have control over their healthcare benefit plans in the way that they like to think that that they're really influencing their employee health. There are some good examples of that, but in general, they're just paying the bill, and they don't have control over the rate of increase in that bill, and increasingly they're having to cut back on the quality of the product that they provide to their employees. So I would think that there would be a point at which they would say, just take it. I don't have control, this isn't doing me any good, I should not be in this arrangement, but it hasn't happened yet.
And the premiums going up, and the benefits are getting less and less, and they're shopping it through, insurance, whatever, agents to try and find them the best deals. So I understand they don't like big government. The Republican ticket doesn't like big government, and this would be bigger government, but it would take all that expense. They're also about the bottom line, and it would take that expense off. I watched a documentary called Fix It. Are you aware of that documentary that's out there? It's a new documentary, and it's about the healthcare system. It says $1 in $3 is spent on administrative costs and advocates for the elimination of the insurance industry, that it goes to single payer. We're already set up for it with Medicare. The government would probably absorb some of those employees. It spoke about how much overhead physicians' offices are suffering just to fight with these various insurance companies, and all that staff would be eliminated. I didn't see in this documentary, Fix It, which I do recommend, how physicians would be paid. They interviewed some physicians in Canada who said that they have a wonderfully comfortable lifestyle, and they're not underpaid because they're part of a socialistic system. But I didn't understand, if you eliminate the insurance companies, which I think is huge overhead, and it doesn't work, and industries become obsolete. We don't make horse buggies anymore. So industries become obsolete, and I think it's time for the insurance companies to become obsolete. It's a huge lobby, but if you're going to make Medicare bigger, then you'll absorb some of those employees.
Adam?
I could go on.
No, a number of really excellent points, and really appreciate them. I want to piggyback on a comment you made, but also one on you, which is the question of the provider orientation now. I think one interesting thing is that I think there has been a transition in terms of the way providers view this. The Truman Plan that you mentioned, John, in the 1940s, that was mostly sunk in large part by the American Medical Association, which at that point really spoke for the American medical profession. Right now, today, some polls have showed that a majority of American physicians support Medicare for all. Now, the AMA does not, but in that sense, it's actually not speaking for the American medical profession. And you also mentioned that nurses opposed one of the ballot initiatives, I think in Oregon. And right now, National Nurses United, which is the largest nursing union in the country, has become a very fierce advocate for Medicare for all. So I do think that things are different now, and that there has been sort of a realigning of interests and of opinion on the provider side. And part of it does, I think, sort of relate back to what I was saying earlier about the administrative side and the administrative waste of our healthcare system, which is that physicians in particular are very fed up with the amount of their work week that goes into billing, that goes into administrative tasks, that goes into box checking. And if you took some of those hours out of their day, they would be much more inclined towards the system. So I do think that although the insurers are not going to be on board, I do think that physicians, nurses, other healthcare professionals are in fact quite amenable to this as a concept.
John?
So I fell in love with single payer in 1985 when I entered the Massachusetts legislature and got named to the healthcare committee and started paying close attention to this. And so I've been watching it closely ever since. It's true, Adam, it's true, the polls show significant support for a national health plan. Interestingly, about 2/3 say they like Medicare for all, and about high 40% like single payer. not realizing that they're one and the same thing. Kind of like people not knowing the difference between Obamacare and the Affordable Care Act. But it's also, and if you look at the Kaiser Family Foundation polls, the support is really squishy soft. So if you tell people, yeah, but you're gonna have to give up your private health insurance, a lot of people peel off. Yeah, but there's going to be a lot of new taxes that you're going to have to pay, and a lot of support peels off. It's really easy to, this is like a ripe orange, to peel away a lot of that support that makes it then, which is exactly what happened in Oregon, what happened in California, and what happened in Colorado, and what happened to the Clinton plan, and what happened into the ACA, where support started in the 60s and went down, down, down as Sarah Palin started saying, you know, there are death panels in this law where your grandmother's going to have to come and stand before a panel of government bureaucrats who will say, no, you can't get your medical treatment. And people really believe that stuff. I mean, it just really resonates. And so that's to sort of see. It's almost like, you know, you start this battle and somebody opens the gate of hell, and all of these incredible monsters come flood. It's worse than Game of Thrones. I mean, it's just crazy what comes out when it gets going. And I was there in the Senate in 09 and 10, and I really did have a sense of a bubble. You know, I was working in the Senate, had my TV on all the time, sort of watch, but you just, these missiles and bricks coming at you all, it was incredible, but it's just so volatile, and I look for, and I welcome, and I cherish seeing from the community how this is going to be different, as opposed to just saying, well, this time it's going to be different, because I've been hearing it's really different now. People are finally fed up since 1985, and I've kind of gotten a little bit immune to hearing, yeah, it's going to be different this time.
I do
What's
think
going
if
to
more
be
people
different?
heard from their doctor that this was a better way, that would make a difference. I don't know when that'll happen. I agree that more and more doctors are getting fed up, and I think that there is the potential there for that to influence public opinion in a way that it hasn't in the past.
You remember Occupy Wall Street? Remember Occupy? Yeah. So around the time of Occupy Wall Street, the New York Times did a big Sunday section. And they asked the question, they said, of all of the occupations and professions in the United States, which ones have the highest proportion of their members, their people in that profession, in the 1%? The highest, number one in the United States for the proportion of enrollees of their members who are in the 1% were physicians. Okay, you look at a map of 50 states, the highest paid profession in every state are physicians. Now you're going to bring them down to Medicare payment, okay?
Let me just interject for 1 second. Okay, a couple things. I mean, I think first of all,
after you say this, Adam, then we
have okay. I just want to respond to two things.
Okay.
One, you know, you said that you're going to throw missiles, describe it as this evil socialist beast that's going to come into their homes and take away their health care. Well, if they're saying that about Obamacare, which was an incremental switch, then isn't it better to really do what we want and have the good name call than at least if we succeed on something that really achieves the long-term goals? Either way, the name calling is going to be the same. I would just say that. And in terms of the physician community, yes, physicians are well paid, but they have, opinion polls do show support, and that's a good thing, that physicians are coming on board with a proposal that would make a lot of people's lives a lot better, including their patients.
Okay. Questions?
Hi, my name is Maya. I'm a student at Boston University. First of all, thank you for coming and talking to us. My question, well, I think first of all, I think a lot of this conversation has been focusing on a lot of the policy reform and very top-down perspective, but I wanted to know what you guys think about improving the actual health outcomes of citizens and how that helps. I think economically it makes a lot of sense because a lot of the high users of healthcare is what makes a lot of it so expensive. So how can we, implement a lot of the preventative care and a lot of the public health aspects into a single payer system? I think because the Affordable Care Act really at least try to address and the buzzword of public health and social work are the social determinants of health. And so I don't know, what are your guys' thoughts on this?
I would say you could switch to a single payer and have it be done in a way that supports all those kinds of goals and improvements, or in a way that doesn't. My personal opinion is if you were going to make the switch and you wanted it to actually improve population health, you would have to do things very differently than we do in the American healthcare system, and frankly, even more broadly than that, in the American social welfare system. So other countries predominantly spend less than us on healthcare, but spend a lot more on social supports that might have a lot to do with healthcare outcomes. So things like housing and transportation and other supports that really make a difference, better mental health care, that really make a difference in terms of people's healthcare use. So that's one thing we could do as a country, under a single payer or not. I think more aggressive changes in how we pay people and how we budget for care would make a difference. So the Affordable Care Act did make some movements in this direction in terms of accountable care organizations and whatnot. But they were pretty weak attempts at changing the incentives so that doctors and other providers really had an incentive to keep people healthier and keep them out of hospitals, and keep them, give them the right preventive care to prevent disease. And then lastly, I think it gets to what Adam talked about, having a structure of coverage so that people aren't avoiding using care because they're covered for the things that they need.
One brief comment. I think that we, of course, want to keep people out of the hospital. Nobody wants to be hospitalized. Nobody wants to really go to the doctor unless they have to in general. But what's out there to keep in mind is that as Americans, we actually don't use more healthcare than people in other countries. And I think that's a sort of a misimpression that people have. We don't spend more days in the hospital. We don't get hospitalized more. We don't go to the doctor more on average than other high-income nations. So, yeah, we want to improve health, but we shouldn't view this as a way to reduce the amount of healthcare that people use. Overall, we use less than a lot of people in other peer countries. Add that, single payer is one important thing to do as a nation, but we need to do a lot more. It's not going to, fix climate change. It's not going to fix environmental exposures to pollution and lead in people's water. There's a huge host of things that affect health that are going to go beyond single payer. But I do think that, as Anya mentioned, not having those financial barriers to care so people, when they need it, it can improve population health.
I'd just add one thing that most people don't understand. There's a body, a U.S. advisory body called the Preventive Services Task Force, the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force. They evaluate, it's a group of volunteer, mostly physicians and researchers. They evaluate every clinical preventive service that comes into prevalence and use, and they give it a grade of A, B, C, D, E, F. And under the Affordable Care Act, every clinical preventive service graded by the task force as A or B must be carried and offered by every insurance carrier in the United States with zero cost sharing. And most people don't know that. But so, by the way, the Affordable Care Act was a major, huge step forward in terms of preventive service. Unrelated to that, a host of preventive services for women's health as well.
And Medicare.
That's where the contraceptive coverage without any cost sharing offered by, mandated on all employers came from, is in the Affordable Care Act. So yeah, we've got a lot more to do on prevention, way more. And we've made some really important progress in the past decade.
Interrupt for just to take a question from Slido that I think is very legitimate. It is, why is there only one physician in the panel and no one from the opposing side to single payer? Canadians wait months for treatment and want to come to the US. And I would, it's not true. Well, also I just want to acknowledge that we don't have a full spectrum of views here on single payer, and that when I conceptualized the panel, I was thinking more about the cons being that it's just not doable. Like that's the biggest con, as opposed to, but there is a whole, this is sort of a Massachusetts spectrum, I guess, but I do want to acknowledge that it's not a full spectrum, and that wasn't how I conceptualized it. Does anybody want to say anything else about the cons?
I think it's I think we ought to recognize in the United States that unlike every other developed country on the planet, the issue of whether access to medical care should be a right is a contested proposition. Mm-hmm. And that's not true in Western Europe, in Germany, in Australia, and the other countries that make up what's called the OECD. But it is here. We have a deep, going way back 400 years or so, libertarian strain in our culture that says, government, leave me the heck alone. I'll be responsible myself. Do what you want, but leave me out of it. And that endures today. And it really makes us stand out, and we ignore it at our own risk.
Thank you. Yeah. Question.
Yeah, well, one quick comment and then my question. Just to what you just said, Professor Mcdonough, there's polling data that show over 90% of the general population agrees with the statement that healthcare should be a right guaranteed by government to everyone. And I can provide you with a reference later if you'd like. My question primarily to Professor Wallach is, would your advice to advocates for single-payer health insurance be to abandon the state-level movement and focus all of our energies on the national movement? This is really practical because, as you probably know, in Massachusetts, there are bills in both the House and the Senate, in the State House and in the State Senate. And there's also a movement, a grassroots movements for national health insurance. So I'm curious on other panelists as well on that question.
Yeah, so I talked about the sort of universal challenges that I saw, the biggies. There's a whole other slate of challenges that are very state-specific, having to do with federal constraints of federal law, problems with state competitiveness and tax structure, and the fact that, unless you're Hawaii, it's very hard to increase a whole lot of taxes and not have an adverse impact on your economy. The fact that people can actually move their income out of state. So it's much, much more difficult to do this at a state level. I don't want to say impossible, but much, much more difficult. So I think in practical terms, it's much more likely to happen at the federal level. I think the state support is good symbolism in the sense that, or a good measure of how people feel and how much effort they're willing to put into it and how much that's reflected in elected officials. But the practical matter is that it would be much more difficult to implement at a state level.
Clear answer. Next question.
I think in the national conversation, there's been a lot of confusion of terms and a lot of the discussion. I mean, Bernie Sanders goes around talking about Medicare for all, but he's describing a program like Adam is describing. And they're really very different things, as a couple of speakers have already pointed out. And nobody really gets into the specifics in the national conversation about, what kind of changes that'll really mean. I think we need some kind of universal coverage, and we're going to have to move in that direction in this country in the near future. But I think I can predict pretty easily that we're not going to have a single payer covering all kind of program like is being described in the next 50 years or so. I mean, that's John and Amy have described the difficulties in doing that, and in this political climate, you can't really do anything. Never mind totally revising and creating upheaval in the healthcare system. So it's not going to happen that way. We need to expand to some kind of universal coverage. Other countries, not every country uses a single-payer system. There are many that use private insurers, nonprofit insurers, but the basic principle is everybody else covered. It's paid for through tax systems of various kinds. I don't know the details. That's kind of thing would be possible in the United States, I believe, but not to throw out the entire system. And if this were 1919 instead of 2019, we could talk about instituting a system like that because we'd be starting from almost nothing. But that's not the case now.
So the biggest expansion of coverage in recent years was the Medicaid expansion under the Affordable Care Act. And I think it probably was, I don't know if John would agree, but I think the magnitude of that was greater than I at least expected, and probably than a lot of policymakers expected. And so I could see incremental expansion through Medicaid when the dynamic of employers sort of being crushed under the weight of health insurance premiums causes them to drop more and more employees from coverage, and more of them become eligible either for Medicaid or for a federal tax credit through the exchange. So I could see expansion incrementally that way, and maybe that's a more likely path than kind of a big bang, but I'm not sure.
You know, I'm sorry.
Just to address one aspect of your question, I mean, you're saying universal coverage good, single payer, is that really how we're going to get there? And I would respond that, if we think that universal coverage through single payer is too costly, then achieving universal coverage without single payer is definitely too costly. Now, I don't think it's too costly. I think we can do it through a single payer system. But if you want to cover everyone and achieve comprehensive benefits and eliminate financial barriers to care, you need a way of controlling overall spending. You need a way of producing efficiencies. And that is what Medicare for All essentially does. Just one other point you made, which is that these are sort of dark days, nothing's happening. It's very easy to feel very pessimistic right now. Certainly nothing's happening under the current government. No one has any illusions on that point. But that will change. In our lifetime, there will be a new government. There will be a window of opportunity. And the point is not that we're going to achieve single payer this year, but that when that window opens, we have a plan ready that we can implement and pass.
I think you make a really important point, because and just take issue with one thing you said, Adam, earlier, where you said single payer is kind of the only real way to get where we want to go. And I don't see it. I really don't see it that way. We look at Germany, we look at Switzerland, we look at Netherlands. Those are systems that mostly have private health insurance coverage, and they have mostly nonprofit health. They're all nonprofit. They're all heavily regulated, but it's a system based upon private health insurance plans that function within their system. And if you look at the Commonwealth Fund, which does some great apples to apples comparisons of different healthcare systems, they've done it 5 times. Just Google Commonwealth Fund mirror, mirror on the wall, and you can get it right away like that. And what they show is that, in fact, they compare 11 countries, and the one thing when they've done this survey, the one consistency is the United States always comes in dead last on the total score. But on 4 of the 5 surveys, Canada comes in second to last. Better than them, Germany, Switzerland, Netherlands, Australia. But there's a lot of different ways to get there. And the notion that it's sort of like it's Canada or it's our mess is just not true. There's other ways to get to a better healthcare system and that has more support of the people. And so you just don't have to do it that way. There's other pathways to get to a much better place. And I'm a big fan of the German system. I think they've just got they've got universal coverage. They've got costs very much under control. They don't have high cost sharing. Most of the problems that people have with the Affordable Care Act, the premiums are too high, the cost sharing is too high, there's not enough controls. Those are fixable problems. We don't have to, I wouldn't mind blowing up the system if we could do it, but if we can't, we can go a long way today with the structure that we have to address the most flagrant concerns that Americans have about their healthcare affordability and security.
Can I just ask you one question, John, though? What makes the German system, as you said, it's nonprofit, highly regulated health insurance companies. Yeah. Do you think that if we came out with a bill right now that said we're taking out all we're cleaning out the shareholders, we're converting all for-profit health insurance companies to not-for-profit companies, we're basically saying what you have to provide, we're basically eliminating cost sharing, is that going to be an easier road? I am not convinced that the German road would be much easier, if at all easier, than what we're talking about, right? I mean, I think what you're talking about isn't really a German system. It's sort of, further subsidizing the private health insurance industry until it sort of incrementally covers people more, and also maybe expanding public sources as well. That's not the German system.
Yeah, but no, you're right. It's not. Well, but if there's a country that we're closer to on the pathway to some kind of universal coverage, I'd argue we're closer to Germany than we are to Canada or to the UK or any of the other single-payer systems. And I think that there's a pathway there. And I think it would be very hard to transform the insurance industry into nonprofits. I don't see that in the cards. But I would say, for example, you've got a big part of Medicare right now. It's called Medicare Part C. And it's also known, it's more popularly known as Medicare Advantage. And it's the part of Medicare where you go into Medicare and instead of just doing fee-for-service, the Bernie Sanders approach, you actually enroll in Blue Cross or Harvard Pilgrim or Tufts Health Plan and you get your care, you're in managed care. More than half of the people aging now and going into Medicare are actually signing up for Medicare Advantage. It's now a third of all Medicare enrollees. I think actually, and it wouldn't be my number one choice, but I think that, and by the way, the insurance industry loves Medicare Advantage and the drug companies love Medicare Advantage. I think if you wanted to have a frame, here's a pathway we can get to single unitary financing and a structure that covers everybody. I would say Medicare Advantage for all or Medicare Part C for all actually might be much more feasible than what you promote, which I love, but I don't think it's going to happen.
But isn't that just a variation on my theme of you can throw money at it? Because the reason they love it is because they get paid.
Yeah, they do. But there was a period when the ACA was done, for every dollar that Medicare fee-for-service cost, Medicare Advantage cost $1.20. And it was created because it was going to save money at better quality. Today, according to the analysts and including MedPAC, it's roughly at parity. So Medicare Advantage now I think it should cost actually less. And I think there's changes that you can make so that it would. And I think there's evidence right now actually for the first time that the quality of care is actually improving. So what I'm saying is that, the notion that there's just one way, that it's like Canada or bust or our continuing deplorable mess, I don't think it's true. I think there's other pathways, and I'm kind of some people, single payer gets very theological. It's kind of like, there's one religion. I'm just very agnostic. Any pathway that gets us to the pearly gates,
I think the fundamental problem, though, is in fact the for-profit insurance industry. I mean, the reason why U.S. healthcare spending has grown in an uncontrolled way in recent decades, and it's taken a totally different path in other countries, is because of the privatized financing through for-profit industries. I think other aspects of Medicare Advantage are actually things we're trying to avoid. I mean, for years, insurers have played games with Medicare Advantage, overcharging, upcoding, right, to make patients seem sicker than they are. They've engaged in other games like avoiding sicker patients. Now, the actuaries
and they do games on the other side too. They do games all around the block.
They do games everywhere. So to my mind, Medicare
and physicians have been known to do some gamings too. By the way, and hospitals, and nursing homes, and home health care agencies, and hospices.
At least the doctors and the hospitals
name a
are
group
actually
of providers that don't play games.
And the insurance companies are actually doing nothing of value. I think that's the big difference. And I think there's a big difference between the providers and the insurance companies. Whatever games you may say that have come from the provider side, they are a necessary part of the system. You're not going to have a healthcare system without a hospital. So there'll be no point in it, right? You're not going to have a healthcare system without doctors or nurses. But you can have a healthcare system without private health insurance companies. Also, let's not forget the overhead and the profits taken by Medicare Advantage make it distinctly less efficient than traditional Medicare, which has a overhead of 2%, and Medicare Advantage is higher. Certainly, private insurers in general have a overhead of greater than 10% across the board. So there are distinct efficiencies with single payer that you're not going to achieve by just subsidizing the private health insurance industry until they cover everybody.
And there are distinct inefficiencies and bad outcomes from a totally open-ended fee-for-service system that just says to the provider community, you're in charge, do what you want in terms of uncoordinated care, in terms of errors, in terms of so much else. I will say it, I mean, managed care is not a popular, managed care actually done right and done well actually produces better care and better outcomes, and it makes so much more sense than saying, let's just turn the whole system over to unregulated fee-for-service. I think that is really a crazy move to do.
And to be clear, the House bill does not do that. It has fee-for-service for office providers, but hospitals would receive global budgets, lump sums to cover all operating expenditures. That's not fee-for-service. That is, in fact, I think, a more rational way of financing hospitals. It helps them to reduce their huge armies of billers and coders that physicians have to interact with because of the way the system is currently constituted. So again, in the House bill, you do have fee-for-service, but you have global budgets for hospitals, and that's a key efficiency move. Again, as I said, U.S. hospitals spend 25% of their revenue on administration and billing. It's half that in Canada, it's half that in Scotland. That's a key fact. And until we get out that waste, it's going to be very hard to afford the kind of comprehensive first dollar coverage that we believe in.
Pause. Question.
Okay.
Nobody said very much about the public option, but a lot of us remember, of course, and you would be positioned to talk about it, which I wish you would.
I was there in the room.
But,
yeah.
There was sort of a halfway approach that proved to be too toxic at the time. They dropped it out of the plan at some point. I don't know what the details are. But have times changed enough to make that a reasonable approach that doesn't rip up the whole system, which, your opinion is that that's not going to work? Or is that basically in the same position it was 8-9 years ago?
Can you remind us what the public option was?
Yeah, so the public option was very important in the political process, the legislative process. The notion was we would establish these health insurance exchanges in states. In Massachusetts, it's called the connector or the marketplace, whatever. And there'd be an array of private health insurance plans that you could go and choose from. And there would be one so-called public option plan, which would be kind of a Medicare-like option, just fee-for-service. And you could buy that and you would have a choice. And in the legislative process leading to the passage of the ACA, of course, we needed 60 votes to pass it. And we had, for, people don't remember this, but in 29 and 10, for a brief magic 7 months between early July of 2009, when Al Franken joined the Senate, and the end of January 2010, when Scott Brown took Senator Kennedy's, late Senator Kennedy's seat, we had 60 votes. And so when the bill, the Senate version of what became the ACA was put out to the Senate, the Majority Leader, Harry Reid, deliberately put in a public option in the Senate version. And he said then to the advocacy community, he said, okay, you folks are now going to have to deliver 60 votes to make sure that we can do this. And then in the process in November and December, we ran into Senator Ben Nelson from Nebraska, former insurance commissioner, very conservative Democrat. He wasn't the only one, but he became the point person. And he said, listen, I'm not voting for this bill if it has a public option. And no longer then are there 60 votes, there are 59, and then you watch a bill collapse. And believe me, the advocacy community, Healthcare for America Now, I mean, went just crazy in Nebraska trying to shake Ben Nelson loose from the tree. And he just wouldn't let go. And to make something happen, Harry Reid had to take out the public option, and that's how we got the 60 votes to pass. Would it be different in 2021? I think it's impossible to say. But I'll tell you, if you don't have 60 Democratic votes, pushing for Medicare is a waste of time. And quite honestly, if you had only 60 Democrats, I think there's at least a half dozen who you will never shake loose. And you'd need something like a Lyndon Johnson 1965 supermajority when there were 67 Democrats in the US Senate. And that's how Medicare got done. So it's a very valid issue. I think it's a fine idea. I think it's meritorious. And the politics of it, you could never do it through what's called the budget reconciliation route, because it would be a substantive policy change, so you'd have to overcome a filibuster, and that's way too far ahead to even predict whether that's possible.
Anya?
Yeah, I agree that it's a worthy idea. I worry a little bit about it in practice because you'd have Medicare, in a sense, competing against private insurers who are very good at playing the market to make sure that they get better risk than government gets. So I think you'd have to set up the rules of the game to make sure that that didn't happen. And I think if you did that, be a way of bringing better risk into the Medicare program and could have beneficial effects in that way. So, you know, again, the same way that Medicaid was the biggest expansion on ACA, you can imagine these incremental expansions where, you know, we're already at government bar healthcare in this country, even though people think it's a heavily private industry or enterprise. You could imagine it going to, you know, 75% of the population through mechanisms like Medicaid and Medicare on an incremental basis, as long as it's a fair shake and government doesn't just get the bad risk out of it.
Thank you. Question?
Hi, thank you for the conversation. So I recently went on Medicare, and
Me too. Oh wait, no, I didn't. I turned 65, but I'm still covered where I was.
Well, I was flabbergasted at the complexity of the system.
Oh yeah.
And so I sort of have a dual question comment. One of them is, I mean, the whole conversation we're having and the pros and cons of single payer, but I totally don't get calling it Medicare for all. I am shocked by how bad of a system it is as a consumer. I think of myself as someone who's smart and who can figure things out. And it was mind-boggling to try to figure out the different options, and the way it basically feels like a gotcha game. And in one place after the next, it's gotcha. You can fall through the system. You can make a mistake unintentionally. You can, like, I don't get any wisdom of expanding that concept for everybody. It feels like, and especially with the increasing population in our age range, it feels like that alone is a place to try to direct attention to cleaning up the system and to simplifying it. And it seems to me that it's absolutely necessary. I mean, as part of the gotcha game, you have to have either supplemental insurance or go on the so-called Advantage plan. And even if you go on the Advantage plan, there's, you know, multiple options, and then you try to compare the costs of them, and it's just terrible. And I've actually wondered, like, I mean, this is a little bit in jest, but it's not entirely in jest. I mean, people are so into gaming. Like, how about a game, you know, preferably like a card game, but even an online game that really just mimics Medicare so that people understand what Medicare is. And then from there, try to come up with some better solutions. And so maybe somebody who's interested in working with developer. This wasn't really meant to be a
It's an app.
but I really did want to speak to that the Medicare system is horrible. And so I don't get why when you're talking about single payer, which you've obviously given a lot of thought to, I don't get why you interchange the words Medicare for all. And so
Thank you.
I welcome any comments, suggestions, et cetera.
Yeah, I think that's I really appreciate that comment, and it's a good point. Medicare, in many ways, is a mess. There is all the choices you mentioned, and that's because of the privatization. You're deciding between these different Medicare Advantage plans. There's Medicare Part D, which is the drug plan, and you have to choose.
It's not only because of the privatization.
Right. No.
If you don't choose some privatization, then you're in even deeper.
Because you have the co-pays.
And if you don't, since you are currently employed and you're under your employer's plan, if you don't watch out, you could be uncovered. It's happened to a friend of mine who accidentally thought she had signed up and blah, blah, blah. But, I mean, it's not just because of the private insurers. The Medicare doesn't really cover enough, so you have to have something else.
No, I totally understand that. So it's not only that, it's also the fact that Medicare is not good enough, that there's holes in the coverage, and that people have to take out supplemental plans to fill those holes, to fill the copays and all that. And I think that's a very fair critique of the Medicare for All language. People use that language because it is something familiar. We do use the phrase improved Medicare for All in order to address that. But look, what matters isn't so much what we call it, apart from maybe the politics. What matters is what kind of program are we talking about. And the program that we're talking about, we call it improved Medicare for All. People call it single payer as well. It's a public plan that would cover everybody. You'd be enrolled when you were born, or when you became a resident of the United States. You'd have it through your entire life. There would be nothing to sign up for. There would be nothing to enroll or disenroll for. And there would be comprehensive coverage without the cost sharing, so there wouldn't be a need for the supplementary plans. So that is what it is. But I completely appreciate your point that some people may be a little bit scared by that framing, and maybe that's something that we should think about more.
I don't think it's just a little bit scared. I think it's misleading. And I think that I think it doesn't let you have a real conversation about what single payer would look like. And then if you extend single payer, what does it look like? What about all the people who are employed in the healthcare industry, in the insurance industry and stuff? I mean, what's the simulation of playing out all these pieces as you try to simplify? And does everybody have the same plan, or do some people choose to have more?
Same plan. Everybody has the same
one
plan. One plan for everybody. And the general concept here is equality, right? That we're all human beings, that we all have an equal right to health care, and that we should all have equal access to the healthcare system. And that should be true regardless of our age, regardless of our income, regardless of our race, and that we should be, treated equally by the healthcare system. And that's the essential premise, the underlying philosophy of the Medicare for All system. You might say theology, but that is the concept.
So I'd add a couple things. I have tried to advise parents and grandparents on enrolling in Medicare, and I agree it's really complicated. And I've got
You have a PhD.
I have a PhD in health services research, and
That's no help.
Yeah. And I think part of it does have to do with the privatization and with the different parts, which are very confusing. I think part of it is just that it's really not great customer service. And I think part of it is also that it's a categorical benefit in the sense that you are in the program because you're 65 or older, or you have certain disabilities. You meet certain categorical requirements. Medicaid used to be like that. And still is to some degree, mostly for long-term care. But one of the things that the Affordable Care Act did was make everybody below a certain income level in the US eligible for Medicaid. And what that allowed states to do that wanted to really use that as a mechanism for reducing their uninsured rate was to greatly simplify the eligibility and enrollment process, so that we really made efforts, at least in the state. I was Medicaid director in Rhode Island. I also worked on these issues to some extent in Vermont. States like that really wanted to maximize coverage through the Medicaid expansion basically opened the doors and said, come on in and we'll make it as easy as we possibly can. We'll hire people to help you sign up. There were federal dollars for this in the early years of the ACA, so that made it a little easier. But it really was a sea change in those states that wanted to change their policy in terms of making it easy to sign up and understandable to sign up. So I can imagine that kind of transformation could happen in Medicare, but it would have to be kind of a deliberate policy. That hasn't been the policy of the federal government. It has been more make it as complicated as possible so that maybe some people don't quite make it onto the rolls.
And actually, that's related to a question that came in over Slido: is the federal government qualified to run a single payer platform? What are the chances of success?
Well, I would be reluctant to hand over a directive to the Trump administration to build a single payer system, as well as a Republican Congress. I mean, and that's the reality of it. I mean, right now we have the ACA, and it's under constant assault from this administration to just weaken it and undermine it in every way they can. And so that is part of the reality of trying to make these things happen in our democracy.
Adam,
yeah. I agree that who's in power matters, but let's not forget, if we don't think that the federal government is capable of running a health care program, then we should completely end Medicare, right? Medicare is a federally run healthcare insurance system, right? So if we truly don't believe that it can do it, then privatize Medicare, get rid of it, and send it out, into the center of the sun. No one really thinks that. It can do it. We can in fact go to the moon. We can run a health insurance program, but I certainly agree there are challenges depending upon who's in office.
It's not about, well, it is about the administrative complexity at times, but it's also just about the political choices that get made. I mean, in the Oregon ballot initiative, because the Constitution of Oregon had some anti-abortion language. There was something about it, but they realized that if they did the single payer, then that elective abortions could not be covered under it, and the single payer community ended up coming out against the ballot initiative. And that was in Colorado in 2016. There was a constitutional amendment that had passed around right to life. The side issues that you think are just side issues, when it gets down and dirty and something's really happening, the way these things play out is surprising and sometimes appalling. We almost lost the Affordable Care Act in the last out of the ninth inning over language around abortion and whether or not people could use exchange coverage for abortion, and it was pretty it was not pretty.
So I'd like to do one more question and then have closing statements. And to people who asked questions on Slido that I didn't get to, I'm sorry. I just gave.
So I'm a retired cardiac surgeon, and I can attest to the complexity of Medicare and how difficult it is to sign up for it, as I did. But I would, thinking about how a government system would run, it's not just about financing the system, but running the system and making it more cost efficient. And my memories of a government-run system was a VA hospital when I was a resident, and then being the admitting officer of the day and getting a call from the ER physician that we had to admit this patient with a rash because we had to meet a certain quota to be reimbursed for our hospital beds and stay during that period of time and during that. So a government-run system is not always cost-efficient or cost-effective and efficient in many ways. I would also comment to Adam that I think many of my colleagues, even the most concerned, in favor of a single-payer system, but maybe not a federally run system other than financing.
And to be clear, the bills that we're talking about would not constitute a national health service and a VA service. They would constitute a national health insurance system. So private care would remain delivered predominantly through private provider, federally financed.
Wrapping up, I hope this has, I know it must have been stimulating. It would be so interesting to hear whether you feel like you have changed your mind in any way. Would you care to conclude?
Sure. So as I said at the outset, I hope I didn't come across as too negative, but I have been through a lot of very practical battles around this, and I think there are barriers that we have to recognize. I wish I knew more about the special political sauce that would make it possible to address those and get across the finish line. I don't feel like I have a lot of wisdom around that. I still am not sure whether plugging away in the way that Adam does, or plugging away in some incremental way, or just waiting for things to get so bad that they blow up because more people are totally frustrated. I'm not sure which of those paths is right. But ultimately, I think that something more rational, whether it's what Adam describes or what John was describing in terms of a German approach, has to come to us, because this is just, I'm not sure what John's words were, but it's a god-awful mess. And part of what frustrates me about it is that it's a terrible system in so many ways, and yet it's really good at hiding its own flaws, so that we don't have rational conversations about what's right and what the real solutions are. So in my heart of hearts, that's what I hope for, is that we can at least advance on that front to where we reveal more of what's going on in our system and what the range of options are for addressing it, because it's really not serving very many people.
I would agree with that, and I appreciate really this conversation and my the panelists' thoughtful comments. You know, I might end on a little bit of an optimistic note. Think about this for a moment, how far we've come, you know, in recent years. Now maybe the Affordable Care Act, I think it probably did help advance the conversation on this issue. But right now, single payer, improved Medicare for all, whatever it is we want to call it, national health insurance, is closer to the center of the national political discussion than it's been since the 1970s. Even in the last few years, this has moved from an idea that was mostly on the fringes of respectable discussion to the middle of the discussion. And why is that? I think there's a few reasons. I think for one thing, there has been a growing sense of healthcare as a right and as something that everyone deserves. I think at the same time, many people have seen these sort of grotesque attacks on public health care systems from the current administration, pushing people out of Medicaid, you know, other sorts of attempts to repeal the Affordable Care Act that would have people out of their health care coverage. But I also see growing support every day. Our organization, Physicians for National Health Program, has seen extraordinary growth in our student arms, our student chapters. Medical students across the country are organizing behind this idea. In Congress, we've seen, more than half of Democratic representatives get behind a bill in the House. We've seen 16 co-sponsors of Senator Bernie Sanders' bill, whereas previous versions of that bill had precisely 0 co-sponsors, okay? This is enormous progress. I don't deny the political barriers that are ahead, and I don't think that it's easy, and I think that there are major discussions that need to happen. But I don't think this is impossible to accomplish. I know we can accomplish it. We've taken extraordinary strides as a nation in the past. This will be another one of those extraordinary strides, and it will take a movement. It's not going to be accomplished by policy wonks and journalists and researchers. It's going to take a real people's movement. But with that kind of energy, I think it can be accomplished. But we don't know when.
So concluding as a policy wonk.
I like to think
I too am an optimist, but I think I'm a pragmatic optimist in terms of sizing up opportunities and what the real opportunities are, as opposed to kind of what we just wish. I believe that we have a mighty good chance in early 2021 of having, for the first time since 2009, Democratic control of the House, Senate, and the White House. That provides an opportunity for some important and urgently needed progressive change. On health care, I believe that the most important burning questions on Americans' minds, on the majority of Americans' minds, can be addressed and fixed through the Affordable Care Act without burning down the house. And that we need to be utterly, ruthlessly pragmatic about where we want to invest the political capital that may come in early 2021. And if I had big money to put big poker chips on the table for what I would want to invest in, I want to invest in climate change. I want to burn down the house to try to address this global emergency. I'd rather burn down the house on immigration and voting rights and guns rather than, for the third time in a row, when Democrats have unitary control, once again we throw all the dice into health reform and end up in a process that we then lose control of the Congress in the first midterm election, and we've had just a 2-year window to get stuff done. And I think we need to be smarter. And we've been here before, and we've seen what can happen. And I think we've got a responsibility, because we all care about more than just health policy. And so I think we have to be really measured and careful and smart in terms of how we move forward.
Well, all very measured and careful and smart panelists. Thank you. Thank you all so much for coming, and please join me in thanking these wonderful guests.
Nice job.
Thank you.
Well done. Good job.
Yeah, I want to see a rematch. Thank you.
Crew members killed in Al-Qaeda al-Qaeda attack on the USS Cole 19 years ago. NPR's Nina Totenberg reports the court ruled today a $315 million judgment against Sudan, providing support in the attack must be set aside for now.
In November, Lori Triplett, whose husband was killed in the attack, emerged from the Supreme Court shaking.
I really wanted to scream while I was sitting there, but I knew I couldn't. This case has lingered so long, so long.
It will be longer now that the Supreme Court has ruled that lawyers for the victims made a mistake by sending notification of the suit to Sudan's ambassador in the U.S. instead of Sudan's foreign minister at his office in Sudan. That means the lawsuit will have to go back to square one. There may be a